Welcome to the Soft Life with Saddie Baddies. Saddie Baddies is the antidote to mental health stigma, and this podcast is hosted by yours truly, Priscilla O. Adjaman. We are a virtual sanctuary centering Black and multiracial people, and we prioritize the mental and emotional nourishment that is the foundation of collective healing in our communities. Thank you for being here. Welcome back to the Soft Life podcast. Today we have Dr. Alicia Hodge, who is joining us, and I'm so excited to speak with her. I am so happy to have you here, Dr. Alicia. Welcome to the Soft Life podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here as well.
Thank you for joining us today. So, we always start off by asking each guest how they're feeling in this exact moment. Just describe how you're feeling, your surroundings, your environment, so we can kind of get grounded into the space together.
Yeah. So I would say right now I'm actually feeling pretty calm, which isn't always the case.
Yeah.
um, I'm like home, settled. It's Friday, like kind of the ease into some nice things this weekend. So I'm in my office, which is obviously intentionally very calming, nice colors, pretty serene. So I'm actually feeling pretty positive and calm.
I love that. I'm so happy to hear that. Yes, your office looks beautiful from what I can see.
Thank
And
you.
um, really happy to hear that you're easing into the weekend. So, would love to know your origin story in your own words. And that can mean anything to you. That can be, where you grew up, the city you're from, your siblings, your upbringing. But what is your origin story in your own words? Who is Dr. Alicia Hodge in a short and sweet?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say when I think of the origin story, it's a pretty direct path, meaning some people sort of like stumble into what they're doing, but I've always, I would say I describe myself as curious. So I've always just been curious about why things happen and who people are. And I think that led me on a pretty straight path to psychology. I've always been the person that people talk to. I've always wanted to know more and why. And I've always enjoyed just people, if that makes sense. And so for myself, I also like to solve puzzles. And I think the biggest puzzles are people. And
Yes.
so I think that led me down a path of just self exploration, but also understanding how we can all experience one thing and see it differently. And going through that experience, especially in college, I think led me to cement psychology to say, like, how is it that we're all in the same room, but we're seeing and feeling different things? And I sort of looked at it in a sense of how can I use that information to help people make the most of their situations? Because, in reality, we have life going on every day, but it's really a matter of your perspective that
Yeah,
determines your experience.
I love that. And so growing up, depending on where your surroundings were like, living in a city versus living in the suburbs, how do you think that shaped your interest in wanting to become a psychologist?
And when you said, where are you from? I was going to make sure that I did say, I'm from New England. I'm very proud of
Okay.
that. Um, I think now living in DC, there's probably like a perpetual argument of is DC the South, but my answer is yes. Um,
It depends on who you ask. Cause I ask some people, they're like,
yep,
no, it's not. I'm like, kind of, but yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
DC is masquerading as a northern city in the South, but uh,
Mhm.
I
Very
think
much
that,
so.
yeah, I think that even that, right, is about like values and perspectives and the way people act and the way people show up. I remember when I first moved here, like strangers were speaking to me, and I was like, what's going on? Like, why are y'all doing this?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
perceived it at first as actually an unpleasant experience, and now it is pleasant to me. But I say that to say, you know, um, I think if you think about traditional ways of being, like up north is more kind of like straight to the point, direct, and maybe even less interactive and less talkative. And I think in a way that might have shaped my desire to be more open and talk more in some
Mhm. No, I definitely understand. I feel like your surroundings and your environment shape so much of who you become, especially as an adult, because especially if you start off in your formative years or your early teens in a certain area or an environment, it really plays a big role into how we develop as adults. So I always like to ask and get a feel of where your roots are essentially.
Yeah.
And can you share more about your journey specifically into psychology? Like, what was your educational background, and how did your experience pursuing your psychology career, what was that like?
Yeah.
And right now we're in an era right now where there are more Black mental health professionals, but this is still very new.
Mhm.
This industry and this field is still pretty new. So would love kind of more of your insight on your personal career journey into being a
Mhm.
psychologist.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I love to share about the journey because, like you said, there are very few Black mental health professionals. And even though there are more, the number is so small. So, specifically for myself, being a Black woman that's a psychologist, Black psychologists, about 6% of us. And that's on, I mean, essentially on record of all the American Psychological Association members, but it's a very, very, very small number. Um,
Yeah.
and so, people may not have someone in their family or that they know that can tell them about that journey, about what it's like to pursue that career. So I will emphasize it's a lot of education, and as it should be, right? If you want a
Yeah.
medical professional. But essentially, I went through high school with an idea that I was interested in psychology. And then when I got to college, that was the standard 4 year degrees. I did major in psychology. I also minored in criminology because I had a thought that maybe I wanted to be. This is before it was popular at the time, but I thought I might want to be an FBI profiler. So,
Didn't we
so
all at some point? Literally.
right,
I think we all had that dream at some
right,
point. Yep.
right. And so I pursued a little bit of that in criminal justice. And then I went on to get my master's because that's required to be doing at
Right.
least clinical therapy. After that, that was a 2 year degree. And then I started working doing therapy in community mental health. And that was a typical 9 to 5. I was seeing a good number of clients a week. It was a little bit stressful.
Yeah.
And then I kind of had the sentiment, I'd always wanted the highest degree, which is a PhD or a Saddie, which is a doctorate of
Mhm.
psychology. That's what I have. And so I went back to school again after the 6 for another 5. So a doctoral
Wow.
degree is a minimum typically of 5 years, longest is
Yeah.
7 that it can
Wow.
take, to do your research. So it took me 5 years. So all in all, the math, I don't have it all there, but that's almost 10 years education essentially.
Yeah.
And then
Higher
after that,
education at that.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, during that time, I had to do a year-long internship, which is sort of like an equivalent of a residency for medical doctors, and then I did a postdoctorate training, which was like to specialize me. So
Wow.
a lot of education. The journey was long. It was a little bit difficult, but I think the biggest part of it is there was a lot of self-exploration. So even that in and of
Yeah.
itself was really valuable.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you went through obviously, your standard schooling, but there was also a lot of introspection and self-discovery throughout that process. And I would love to know how your business Slay Your Anxiety came about. And I first of all love the name Slay Your Anxiety because it's so spot on. I would love to know more about Slay Your Anxiety, its background, and your intention with creating this safe space for clients, community, and just overall anyone looking to improve their mental health.
Yeah. So slay your anxiety is definitely one of my phrases. I do like to share the credit with my friend and fellow
Mhm.
psychologist, Dr. Joy Bradford, who
Yes,
is
we
the
love
creator.
her.
Yep,
Yes.
Therapy for Black girls. She is just a wonderful woman, and
Yeah.
we had been getting to know each other, and I was invited onto her podcast,
Mhm.
and that was the title of the episode.
I love it.
And so I think it kind of is like a play on words in the sense of slay, like Black girl
Yeah.
slay, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But also literally slay your anxiety. And so that just kind of built traction on its own. And I think it just embodies so well what I am helping people to do and what I'm encouraging people to do. So
Yeah.
I think the inspiration is also in the sense of like anxiety is like a dragon
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it can feel overwhelming and consuming and powerful and scary. and the idea of like you can equip yourself with certain skills, you can definitely slay your anxiety and like be cute doing it too.
I love it. I love it so much. I mean, I feel like Saddie Baddies and Slay Your Anxiety are they're friends.
Yes, I
They're
agree. I agree.
sisters because it's like the duality of embracing your what some people might consider a weakness, but really in reality it's human. It's being human,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
But embracing the duality of, you can be someone that is dealing with this or going through this, but you still are you at the end of the day, and you can still
Exactly.
slay, you can still be a baddie. I love that so much. So can you tell us more about kind of like the beginning stages of creating this online space and, in-person space as well for um, folks to learn more about their mental health? Like what would be kind of the ideal uh the ideal person who is looking for those resources with
Mhm.
Slay Your Anxiety? How does Slay Your Anxiety provide that those answers?
Yeah. So, when I first started, I guess what you would call an online presence, it was
Mhm.
very new. Like, and in this day and age, I think we see a lot of TikTok
Yes.
therapists and we see things like that. But
Yes.
this was like pre-TikTok, which is hilarious to make it sound like an era.
It
But
really is, isn't it?
but essentially, going through grad school, it was strongly discouraged of you to have any part of your persona revealed. It was
Yeah.
strong. You were strongly encouraged not to be on social media, to keep all your pages locked down and private and things like that. But as I learned more, and I'm doing therapy one to one in the therapy room, but I had a strong desire to impact more than one person.
Yeah.
And the reality is every person is not going to come across me in the therapy room. It's just A, it's impossible. And B,
Yeah.
we know even within our community that access to mental health is not there. The resources at times are not there. And so I thought to myself, how do I make a greater impact and give people some basic skills? And also, not everyone maybe needs therapy itself
Mhm.
or has a diagnosis, but there are tips that we can all use to
Yeah.
help manage our anxiety. So I think for myself, when I first started my Instagram page, it was actually called Stressed But Well Dressed.
I love it.
Because I used to really be into fashion. So it was like combining fashion and
Yeah.
aesthetics with mental health tips. And then I kind of moved specifically into the anxiety space. But I was like, therapists and things like that, we can still have aesthetics. We can still be funny. Like I was sharing memes.
Yeah.
And I think it just made it more relatable. And it also really allowed me to express who I was as a person. Because, like you said, even though I'm a psychologist, I have that hat
Mhm.
on, I'm still me. I'm still very humorous and
Yeah.
sarcastic and quote unquote down to earth. So I
Yeah.
think that was sort of like my mission behind sharing resources with people, helping engage, do basic Q&A, and even joke about like,
Yeah.
my anxiety told me today that the world's gonna blow up, but that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Just making it a little bit more approachable because one thing that I've realized too is when creating discourse and dialogue about mental health, sometimes when we create this fear around it or we make it so
Mhm.
serious, people don't want to talk about it. They're like, I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm trying to have a good time. But if you
Right.
can incorporate some personality, some humor, some lightheartedness, it makes it a lot easier to approach it and to unpack some of those topics that are harder, right? And that's what, I think about some of the TV shows and media, how they're doing this now in a very, kind of
No, it's like
formulaic
a
way.
palatable way, right? It's
Yes,
a way that it's
palatable.
not
Yes.
intimidating, but it allows
Yeah.
people to really get the concept, and push past stigma really, because the more you talk about it, the
Yes.
less stigmatized it becomes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's dive into learning more about anxiety. I mean, you are the expert when it comes to understanding and unpacking anxiety, especially in Black folks and people of color. And so I really want to kind of unpack what anxiety is. We have done a couple episodes about anxiety, but first of all, you being the expert is going to help a lot of us really understand and maybe ask some questions that we're like, okay, Google's not doing it for me. I need
Mhm, mhm,
a
yep.
licensed professional to really help unpack. And what I would love to know is what is the difference between anxiety and stress? Because that's something that we hear interchanged a lot,
Mhm.
but there are differences. So I would love to know what is the actual definition of anxiety versus just dealing with the regular stress of being a human and being alive here day to day?
Yeah, that's a good question, and, I get asked it a lot, and I will be honest, I give a slightly different answer every time, which sort of
Mm,
speaks to the fact that they are so close to one another, and they are used interchangeably, and there are several ways you can distinguish.
okay.
And so stress itself, I would say, is typically like an ongoing experience, whereas anxiety is more like a state. So, anxiety is a biological, physiological response that happens to us typically when danger presents itself.
Mhm.
Now, danger can be a big umbrella depending on who you are. Danger, of course, is something like falling down the stairs, but it also might feel like a phone call depending on what's going on
Mhm.
in your life, right? And stress is sort of much more of a prolonged experience, meaning like some sort of transition, a loss, an event. And so anxiety can persist, like that state can persist, but stress is more about what's going on. It can present with physical issues. We know that chronic stress is really, right, not good for you.
Mhm.
But it's not the same thing as anxiety, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like stress is it's something that's constant, and anxiety is kind of our response to it, is what it sounds like in a way, and
Yeah.
how we interact with the stress.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
I think it's a good way to put it. Like there are stressors,
Mhm.
things, so for example, if I move into a new city, I will have a reaction to that, an ongoing
Yeah.
experience of stress. But typically, stress ends whenever the event ends.
Mm.
Anxiety may not end, for example, after the meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you. That really helps to
Mhm.
explain the difference in how we can tell if we're just being, responding to things that are normal and things that make us nervous or even excited sometimes.
Mhm.
And kind of making that distinction between just responding normally versus, okay, maybe we actually are feeling really anxious, and identifying that those
Yeah,
anxious responses.
yeah.
Another area I would love for you to explore with us is the term cognitive distortions. So I'm
Mhm.
sure that this has been floating around. I've seen this floating around not only
Mhm.
on TikTok, but just through reading, some materials about wellness and mental health, of
Yep.
course. And cognitive distortions is something that I think a lot of folks may not know that there's actually a term for it, but
Yeah.
when you actually break it down, a lot of us tend to do this, or people who may struggle with anxiety
Mhm.
may fall into these ways of thinking, these
Mhm.
mindsets. Can you break down what cognitive distortions are
Yes.
and how they impact us in our mental health, especially us anxious folks?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, that I'm glad that you asked. So cognitive
Mhm.
distortions is a fancy way of saying unhelpful thinking.
Mm,
And so all of us, like you said, in our lives have engaged in unhelpful thinking styles.
yeah.
Now, specifically cognitive distortions, if you Google it, I'm not a fan of Googling everything, but if you Google
Yeah.
like cognitive distortions PDF, you actually will come more than likely to a graphic that has about 10 different
Yeah.
unhelpful thinking styles.
Yeah.
And I often call them styles, or like we all have a top three. So when I'm
Yeah.
first working with someone, I will go over this sheet, and I'll give you an example of some of the things that they are.
Yeah.
One may say black and white thinking, which is essentially is like all or nothing, which means you tell yourself either I won or I lost when there may be so much more in between.
Mhm.
But I get someone to look at these 10 different styles and I say, tell me your top three, because you've more than likely done all of them at least
Mhm.
once. But if you can know and be aware of this is the way that I tend to think, then when you get in circumstances that are, for example, anxiety provoking, you can ask yourself, like, wait, is there a distortion at play here? Am I
Yeah.
doing that all or nothing thing? Am I catastrophizing, which is another one, meaning you are thinking worst case scenario.
Mhm.
Oftentimes people call it mountain out of like a molehill, or
Mhm.
um, there's also personalizing, which means, am I making this about me, or believing that this person is, specifically
Yes.
mad at me versus mad that they were late to work, mad
Yeah.
that they have other things going on that I don't even know about. But if you know, like, these are my top three styles, you can slow down and say, hold on, before I continue with this thought process or before I continue to react, is this a cognitive distortion?
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, as it relates to, folks who are, for example, neurodivergent, I actually learned about cognitive distortions through this page, this mutual page that we follow on Saddie Baddies, and it's actually led by two women, and they're both autistic and have ADHD, and they share these cognitive distortions and how with being neurodivergent, it creates kind of like a filter with their
Yep.
that type of thinking. So, can you talk a little bit more about how these cognitive distortions, as it relates to folks who are neurodivergent or identified being neurodivergent, how that can also affect the way that we view and perceive things as a certain way.
Yes. I think it's important to note that even amongst individuals who may be in a category of neurodivergent, they're still individuals, right? And
Right.
this is why I think therapy, specifically therapy, can be really useful because you can sort of do this exploration of yourself. I think I'm all about self help books and those things, but it's
Hmm.
hard to curate information just for you.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult to sell, right? So there's a lot of generalizations that go on, but I think the key there, what you mentioned is knowing that you have a filter and how that filter operates is going to benefit you as you try to process like situations or your thoughts. So if I'm hypervigilant to when people speak, or I'm hypervigilant to sounds. If you're in a scenario where there's a lot of sounds going on, even that can help you to say, anything that happens from this point on will more than likely be impacted by my overstimulation.
Hmm.
And so that's a chance for you to either reduce the simulation, like, hey, can y'all turn off that? Whatever. Or if
Yeah.
that's outside of your control, then you try to move forward and do something that we call like compensation. Like, how can I compensate for the fact that
Mm.
maybe I am at a lower bandwidth or distracted or triggered, whatever that might
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's such a insightful perspective to have, and really appreciate you touching on how this specifically impacts folks who are dealing with this on a regular basis, and it could actually be more severe because of that
Mhm,
additional layer. So I also would love to explore, what are some of those misconceptions about anxiety, especially anxiety in Black women? Because
mhm,
we know that sometimes with diagnosis or even treating those suffering with mental health issues, specifically with Black women, and because of racial trauma and
mhm, mhm.
microaggressions, right? We have this additional barrier to care. And sometimes with anxiety, for me, for example, when I'm anxious, one of my first signs that I'm anxious is I'm irritable. I
Yeah,
start nitpicking. I start like, just everything irritates me. I'm not calm. I'm not settled. I feel overwhelmed. I'm like, turn off the lights, open the
mhm.
windows, close the door, everybody
Yep,
leave, get out of here. Like, that's
yes,
my, like, when I'm anxious, that's how I present. And, versus somebody else who may not have that same like identity as me, they might just isolate or withdraw. So
mhm.
what are some of the misconceptions, or what have you noticed when dealing with or treating, I should say, anxiety, especially in Black women?
Yeah, so you sort of hit the nail on the head. That was probably one of the first ones I was gonna go to,
Yeah.
because I often ask that question in people, like, "Are you irritable or are you anxious?" Because
Mm,
anxiety presents very often as irritability,
yeah.
um, and also can manifest in a lot of controlling behaviors.
Mm,
And so oftentimes, I'm working with someone and they're like, "Well, you know me, I'm type A, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this." And I'm like, "Yeah, you are, and I'm more interested in where is that coming from? What is driving the car?" There's nothing wrong with being type A, but also here's the thing, if your type A behaviors are driven by anxiety, it has now been accidentally reinforced for all these years. And more than likely you're
mm,
operating in perfectionism, which is still anxiety provoking. Like, I always show up, I always get it done, I have to. No one else is gonna save the day but me. Um,
yeah.
and those types of messages, while there may be some truth to them, that's another example of a distortion, right? It may be overinflated in a way that you now feel like everything's on the line all the time and you're
Yeah.
living perpetually anxious.
Yeah. I mean, just what you shared sounds so much of the reason why these labels and these stereotypes and these tropes, for example, the strong black woman is like,
Mhm.
is she really that strong? Or is she being forced to be
Correct.
have this title and have this responsibility and this role that she may not even want? You know,
Yeah.
she for so many of us, we even from a very young age were given adult responsibilities, right?
Mhm.
So we
Mhm.
are being conditioned to have to be strong even when we don't want to be. So
Right.
I think tying into the some of those misconceptions that you just shared, are there also other factors or other patterns that you've noticed that contribute to some of those stereotypes that you find to be untrue, when
Mhm.
actually sitting down with and treating those
Yeah.
who deal
I
with
think
anxiety?
it's tied to, like you said, the strong black woman, the angry black woman,
Mhm.
um, but especially superwoman
Yeah.
in and of itself, and so those 3 things, again, it's a paradox because who doesn't wanna look competent
Yeah.
and strong and capable? But at some point, everyone is human and they're allowed, like, they need rest, they need help.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to live up to a standard that you've been praised for, you really end up sacrificing yourself in the long run. Even to uphold something that you can probably say out loud intellectually you don't agree
Yeah.
with or you don't want it to be true, but there's kind of this internal process that's chasing it, or running from this idea of I don't want to be a failure. And that's
Yeah.
where I think it compounds the intersectionalities of like race and gender. So
Mhm.
there's so much going on outside of us, that we are responding to. But equally, I could just think of more than 10 clients I've had who all share the same sort of origin story, if you will, of like, I
Mhm.
was taught that I got to be the first in the class. And like, when I came home with a 95, they were like, where's the other five? And
Yeah.
so all of these things are done with good intention because we are, typically hoping to shape our kids into successful individuals. Um, the backfire is that when you're cementing that idea in as a
Mhm.
child, you are very black and white as a child. That's actually
Yeah.
developmentally a thing. So if I come home in the first grade and someone says, "Where's the other five?" I am now mourning and fixated on the a gap of 5 points, and I make that my mission as a kid, right? If I don't get
Mhm.
those other 5 points, I'm a failure. And it
Mm.
seems true, but when you're 35 and it's everyone's hitting milestones and I'm checking
Yeah.
off boxes and how come I have everything around me but not one thing and I'm miserable?
Yeah.
Just,
Ooh.
that's the same person.
Yes. Ooh, that really hits home. That hits
Mhm.
home because I think we're also speaking to a very, broad but also very specific person who
Uh-huh.
might be an overachiever. I think
Mhm.
a lot of times people who tend to, listen to the podcast, go to therapy, they got the Pilates, they are like juicing in the morning, like everything's perfect. And we see a lot of this examples in shows like Harlem, for example,
Mhm.
or Insecure or other
Absolutely.
shows, like even Living Single, like back in the day. It's like we see there is an archetype of a black woman who's got everything together, but she's got one fixation. I think way too often that fixation is her love life, to be honest with
Mhm.
you, because I'm like, girl, you got other fish to fry, but
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
that's
I have a feeling that also too, like, part of the reason that is in my impression of life itself is that it's the
mhm.
least controllable element, right? Like we can control
Yeah.
ourselves. If I want the career, I could try to grind and go get it. If I need money,
Yeah.
houses, I can probably like alter myself. You cannot alter another person.
Yeah.
And so if you have a
Yeah.
perception of who another person also is to be, you're kind of tying your hands because now they are or they aren't.
Yeah. Yes, and it that also again kind of goes back into that black and white
Mhm.
thinking that you just shared. Yes, everything is connected. Everything's
Yeah.
connected. Speaking of, being in a space of specifically, with anxiety and dealing with perfectionism, over being overachiever and that, type of um that environment which kind of sometimes can keep us stuck.
Mhm.
What what do you say about Black women specifically in corporate spaces or workspaces in general? How we deal with anxiety and how we deal with, how does our, I would say, our experiences with anxiety show up specifically in the workplace? Um,
Yes.
and how would you say that's different than, other environments or different settings?
That's a good question. I would say I do, right, sort of position myself as working with women who are high performing,
Mhm.
professional women who typically do exist in the corporate space. Um, and that is a difficult space to navigate
Yeah.
as a human being, but particularly as a Black woman, meaning I want to give this person credit, and I can't remember who said it exactly, but I agree with them that this idea of imposter syndrome as a Black woman in corporate America is actually true in the sense of like it is not meant for you. You were not meant to fit in that
Yeah.
space. And so to feel
Yeah.
as though you don't fit is not
Yeah.
your imagination, actually.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of compartmentalizing. I think that happens, but I think the way anxiety, meaning of your experiences and sort
Mhm.
of that dissimilar fit at times. But I think the way it does show up is in a lot of performance, a lot of
Yeah.
performing, whether that's socially, whether that's doing extra work, not speaking up and feeling able to have boundaries at work
Yeah.
because you feel maybe that you're already viewed negatively, and so you're trying to compensate for that. Um, Sometimes it might look like days off work, right? When the stress is
Mhm.
too much and you're overwhelmed. I think it also can show up as hypervigilance about yourself. A lot of rumination
Yeah.
and reviewing of like, was that right? Should I have said that? Should I have
Yeah.
done that? Um, and I think when I approach that in therapy, it's not about swinging the pendulum to saying like, oh, just do anything. Don't worry about that. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter. But it's more about teasing through how much of this is related to my own experiences, how much of this is related to my work culture, how much of this is related to distortions,
Yeah.
and how do I manage that? And so let's practice boundaries at work, but let's do it on a low risk thing just to
Mhm.
see what that feels like. Because I know a lot of times the internet talks about unlearning as though it's this easy process of like, I'm just going to forget it. Unlearning means you're learning something else.
Right.
And so that still is difficult and it's challenging and it takes practice. And that's the thing. I encourage people to realize that change involves practicing. If I
Mhm.
want to say no more, I actually have to say no more.
Mhm.
I don't say no one time and then I'm like, "Oh, saying no is easy. This
Right.
is great."
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's really, it's really good to understand like the environment that we're in. Obviously you just mentioned you're work closely with high performing corporate professionals, etc. But one thing that stuck out was you mentioned trying things with low risk
Mhm,
low risk opportunities to practice that boundary setting and to practice self-care. And
mhm.
I think for any of us who are maybe even early in our careers or later on in our careers or wherever we are, we can really apply that knowledge and check in with ourselves. Are you taking off more time off from work because you're overwhelmed? Are you pushing things off to the last minute because you are just bombarded and you're not speaking up
Right,
about your workload, right? Are you
right.
being mistreated, but you're afraid, okay, there's not a lot of us in the room that look like me, so I'm going to just put up with it?
Mhm, mhm.
So these are all things that I think we can keep in mind as we, especially going into this new season, and hopefully we can show up better for ourselves and each other by being aware of this. So, you know,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. Talking more about financial anxiety. So this is something that I think a lot of people just glaze over. It's sometimes
Mhm,
like a lot. I think about the times in my life where I was most stressed out, and a lot of times it could be rooted back into like financial anxiety, specifically
yeah.
when I was, in graduate school and not working full time just yet, or even a college student. Just in my
Mhm,
20s, there was it's such a tumultuous era. And I think talking about financial anxiety can also help reduce stigma. I still think that's an area where there's a lot of stigma when it comes to talking about our mental health. So, can you talk more about financial anxiety and maybe what are some of the signs that someone is going through financial anxiety? And with this economy in general, it's happening more and more often that people are feeling overwhelmed or very, very stressed. But would love to hear more about how to approach financial anxiety and when to maybe realize that we need more support.
Yeah. I often find that when people are dealing with financial anxieties, they tend to present on either end of the spectrum, meaning they're avoiding and like apathetic, like, oh, yeah,
Hmm.
girl, I don't know how much money I have. I don't check. I don't look. I get emails. I don't open them,
Yeah.
or, I'm always pressing ignore on my phone, or there's sort of an anxiety that looks more like being very stringent about finances and sort of feeling like maybe despite evidence of financial security, feeling very insecure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think it is important to always look at these topics in light of reality, which is, like you said, our current economic environment is very precarious. I think,
Mm-hmm.
we have student loans coming back up. Um,
Child.
there are a lot of things, there's a lot. And
Yeah.
here's the other thing I want to factor in. In our current culture, there's a lot of showing off online.
Yes. A lot of
Right? And so
flexing.
all of those things, all that aesthetic takes money. If it's
Mm-hmm.
if it's gonna be like the top of the top. And
Mm-hmm.
so I see this interesting thing where people are practicing like this willful ignorance about like, yeah, I don't have any money, but I'm going on vacation. And I think I'm not even judging it. I think it's a backlash against like being told, do all these things, do these things right, work really hard, devote yourself to your job, and you'll get certain rewards. And people aren't seeing that. Like we've seen a lot of people leaving their jobs and pursuing their lives and what they perceive to be as happiness. Now I'm interested to see what financial impact that has. But ultimately, I think spending habits can just be a
Mm-hmm.
reflection of your anxiety in general.
Oh,
Like
yes.
Amazon is so easy to shop, like click. I recently decided like I'm gonna unlink my cards from Apple Pay because there was a meme about this was like, I'm buying stuff on Apple Pay like it's not my money. Like you just press 2 buttons and it's yours. So, that being said,
Yes.
I would say look at your finances and how you operate in your finances, as part of your wellness, meaning like stay
Mm,
abreast, know what your goals are, approach it. I mean, of course, it can be fearful if you're in scarcity or you don't have enough. Who wouldn't
yeah,
want to avoid that? But honestly, I do think finances gets left off the list when we talk about wellness, but I actually think they
yeah.
contribute a lot to your wellness.
Oh, yeah,
So you should be at least checking in on your finances to desensitize yourself from it.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. Like I said, that's financial anxiety and stress is so real, especially if you grew up with having just your needs met, not
Mhm,
any of
mhm,
your wants met. And
mhm.
I've noticed that, for folks who not necessarily grew up like without anything, but their parents had just enough
Yep.
for, you're gonna get maybe one pair of shoes for school, or
Mhm.
whatever, but we're not gonna be able to take you on a shopping spree.
Right.
That later on in adulthood really can kind of be a result of that lack of
Mhm,
having your wants met. And now
mhm.
you're spending, you're going into debt,
Yeah.
your cards are maxed out, you're not able to have a financial cushion because you're trying to make up for lost time from what
Mhm.
you had. And so I think realizing how much our upbringing does play a role in our
Yes.
behavior as adults, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, our home environments specifically and how we respond to stress and how
Mhm,
we maybe even develop anxiety based on our home environments. If you can share
mhm.
a little bit more
And when
about
you
that.
say home environment, do you mean our current one or the one that we came from?
The one that we came from.
Okay. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So our past, so I'll start off with context too. So you mentioned cognitive distortions,
Mm-hmm.
and I specifically am a CBT therapist, which means cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that the style of therapy that I do is I'm very interactive and I focus a lot on someone's thoughts. It's very here and now based, and I think people like it because it's solution focused and like,
Yeah.
us assessing reality. But all therapy, in my opinion, does take into account your past. And
It
so while I may not start off our session being like, tell me about when you were two,
yeah.
I am constantly asking, what does that remind you of? What does that refer to? How was that handled when you were younger?
Mhm.
Because I'm trying to A, get to know more about someone, help you explore yourself, but also make these links between our past experience and our environment is certainly impacting and affecting who we are now.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we see it in that way, meaning I came from, a little bit of scarcity. So now excess, here I come.
Yeah.
Um, but essentially, we are not doomed by our beginnings, but it certainly determines some of the things that we believe and what we do. And we mentioned earlier, I think this all organically is coming together. We talked about distortions, and you said something. I think you used the word filter. The way I
Yes.
usually
Yeah.
describe it to people is like they're like sunglasses. It's a
Yeah.
lens. And
Yeah.
so I'm sure everyone has had this moment, whether you're a glasses wearer where you like take them off and you're like, oh
Mhm.
man, I cannot see.
Mhm.
Um, or you have on sunglasses and you're in the side and you're like, "Man, it is so dark." And you're like, "Oh shoot, I have my sunglasses on."
Yes. Yeah.
So so it's this idea of however you were brought up, those are your sunglasses.
Mm.
Your sunglasses might be a little foggy, you
It
know,
might have some scratches
you know
on them.
right, they might have some
Yeah.
scratches, they may leave you with some blind spots, and I look at
Yeah.
therapy as, like, we're gonna take off the sunglasses, we're gonna look at them, and I'm gonna give you, like, a glasses cleaner and a cloth, and we're
Yes.
gonna shine it up as much as possible
Wow. Yeah.
in a way that we can be aware, in a way that we can learn, "That was the old way that used to work for me, but
Mhm.
how can I pivot now?"
Mhm.
So you made this really good example with the finances. If I come from a family where 6 of us, dinner is just enough, you
Yeah.
gotta hurry up and get your food and eat fast. I might be a fast eater. If
Yeah.
I live alone now, do I need to eat fast?
Yes. Yeah.
No, I don't, right? And so the
Yeah.
idea is how can I start to live in a way that reflects the now when the past is telling me a message? How do I rewrite and edit a new message to myself? Because now you're the adult, you're in charge.
Yes. Absolutely. Wow. I mean, that's tracks so much. Actually, the other day we just had an in-person event, and we did a workshop, and we asked about how, like, our self-care toolkits,
Mhm.
and one person also mentioned how that's also a habit of eating fast, like at home, and how that's also been incorporated into being an adult and still having that habit. And that's something that I'm realizing, wow, like that's something I've done too. Is I don't I've For me, it was more so in the era when I was a student and having to rush all the time because
Yep,
of time scarcity. And now as
exactly.
an adult, I'm like, oh, I can slow down. I have more than 10 minutes to eat. I don't need to rush. So
Mhm.
it's so interesting the way that those habits sometimes are so ingrained in us subconsciously. And when we take a moment, like you said, to wipe off the sunglasses and take a step back, we can realize that some of those are just subconscious things that we haven't brought to the surface just yet.
Yeah, yeah.
um, One more question about anxiety specifically is, how do we know when it's time to ask for help?
Mhm.
And really want to know what the signs are that if you're someone that is going through a really difficult time, or you're not understanding how to manage your experience with anxiety, when is a good time to really ask for help? Because I think we have so much self-care content. We have so much
Yeah.
self-help. There's self-help books coming out all the time. But like, what is really the point when we need to speak up and ask for help?
That that question is a great question because I think it varies for every person.
Hmm.
I like to say at the bare minimum, if you can say to yourself, even without firm description, I don't feel like myself. That
Mm.
is a sign to ask for help. And I don't mean you have to call a therapist that day, but it wouldn't hurt to talk to a friend. It wouldn't
Yeah.
hurt it wouldn't hurt to start to explore what you think is going on. Because I think
Yeah.
so often I see women are like, "Yeah, I haven't felt like myself for months now or years now." And I'm like, "But wait, if you haven't felt like yourself, what have you been telling yourself? Like, oh, it's
Yeah.
fine." Um, and so I think the moment you don't feel like yourself, consider taking care of yourself,
Yeah.
whatever that looks like in that moment. Now, on more of maybe a mental health level, if things are persisting, and I don't mean persistent for months because again, most people by the time they get to me, there's no such thing as too late. But I'm like, I believe in time and in time is everything. You were ready
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I would love to see people come sooner than later.
Mm.
And so if you find that things are being impacted, like significantly, your mood, your sleep, um, if you've had a panic attack or two, like those are things that I
Mhm.
think let's intervene. Let's not cement this new fear of like, uh-oh, I'm different. I'm in distress and I'm trying to make life work. That starts a whole new stream of distortions, negative beliefs about yourself. When the
Yeah.
reality was, I just needed help. There was
Yeah.
nothing quote unquote wrong with me, or I wasn't failing, or. So the idea is that I know we chase something familiar, even when intellectually we can say, hey, this is not working for me. If you catch yourself saying that a lot intellectually, don't wait until you feel ready. Try to ask because that's a perfect example of
Yeah.
practicing. It's a higher risk. It's not the low risk,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
ask for help. Especially if you even have friends who go to therapy and maybe you're
Mhm.
nervous about it, just ask them questions like, tell me, what's your therapy like? What did you have to do?
Mhm.
Start to knock some of the fear off of this journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely appreciate you sharing, some of those signs. And I think really what stuck out is starting as early as possible.
Mhm,
When I started going to therapy when I was like 24, I think
mhm,
7 years ago, I went at a time where I was at my lowest, and it took everything in me to actually make an appointment. And I
mhm.
look back now, I'm almost like looking at it like a preventative point of view, the same way that you schedule out your dental
Yep,
appointments or your
right away.
gynecologist or your doctor, schedule your therapy appointments in advance. Even if you think you're not going to need it, you never know when, if you
Mhm.
do have that resource. And one thing I do want to point out too is if you are, employed or you work, traditional 9 to 5, chances are you probably have an employee assistance program, and that's where you can
Yeah,
have like at least short term counseling or therapy, and eventually you can be linked to more of a long term treatment for your mental health and your
mhm,
wellness. And I have found that using those resources has helped me and saved me time and time again. And definitely encourage people to
yep,
use those resources when you can, at least to get started until you can find the right therapist for you. And, last question, this one's just for you
mm,
is, we talked a lot about challenges when it comes to dealing with anxiety, addressing anxiety, challenges in our mental health, and how the way we think really perceives the reality that we're existing in. But with all of that, what does softness mean to you as a Black woman? And how do you define softness in your own words?
yeah. So the first word that came to mind when you talked about softness was space.
Mm,
And I think that as someone who loves words, as you can imagine,
yes.
I think about space in actually more than one way.
Hmm.
I'm thinking about taking up space. I think it means giving yourself space. So you mentioned like reminding yourself, I don't have to rush. I can choose myself first. I can ask what works for me. I think softness looks like the ability to enjoy things versus just being there on edge.
Mm,
Like to be actually present, to walk away from the weekend and be like, I remember what I did this weekend. Um, I remember this moment that was enjoyable. I can look back on things and not necessarily, or sorry, events and not be like, I can't wait until that's over, but I can actually
mhm,
look forward to them and be like, I can't wait
mm.
until it's my kid's birthday party versus like, I can't wait till this party situation is done.
Yeah, I love that space. That's
Mhm.
beautiful. Giving
Mhm.
ourselves space to be present too is
Yeah.
it's what it sounds
Yeah.
like. That's
Yeah.
so
Absolutely.
beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Alicia. Before you go, we do have a quick rapid fire
Oh,
questions for
okay.
you, just to end on a high note. And these are just five really fun, no brainer questions. So, ready?
Mhm.
Okay.
I'm
So,
nervous.
oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. So, first question: if you could choose only one form of exercise for the rest of your life, what would it be and why?
One form. So, at first, I was gonna cheap out and say, like, something low impacts, like stretching. But to be honest, I would pick weight training,
Yes.
particularly because it's intense and I love the aesthetic element of it, but weight training is so mental, like mind-body connection, forcing
Yes.
yourself to push yourself even when your mind tells you you can't.
Yeah.
I think there's just something very valuable in that, so I'd pick that.
I love that. I just recently started weight training and I couldn't agree more. It's definitely that mind body bond.
Mhm.
Love that. Okay, next question. What is your go-to comfort food recipe when you need a little pick me up?
Oh, it's macaroni and cheese every time.
Mm.
Every time, every time, every time. At 2 o'clock in the morning, it doesn't matter.
I love it. Oh my gosh, love me a good mac and cheese.
Yep.
Okay, next question is what is your go-to self-care activity when you're having a bad day?
That's something that actually has changed over time.
Mm.
It used to be more recent, it used to be driving around. Um, Now since I'm a little more homebound with the family, I would say it actually is putting on my headphones and, like, reorganizing something. So that does have some elements in control, I'm not gonna lie, we talked about anxiety, stress, and control. It's a productive control thing,
Yeah.
but it also just helps me kind of feel like I'm to myself. I'm
Yeah.
doing something enjoyable. I'm listening to obviously old songs from back in my heyday. Um, and I'm really just enjoying the moment and not trying to think forward or think in the past.
I love that. I
Mhm.
do the same thing. I don't even realize it's self-care, but because it almost feels like I'm taking care of my environment, but that is
Mhm.
self-care.
It is.
And yes, definitely can relate to that. Good headphones, good music, and just in your own little bubble.
Mhm.
Um, okay, next question is if you could spend a weekend at a wellness retreat anywhere in the world, where would it be?
So I do have my eyes on Arizona. I think I
Yes.
wanna go to Miraval. I was supposed to go to, I cannot even think of the Homme Noir maybe, like, they had a retreat years ago, and I was
Mm,
gonna be a part of it and speak and, like, get the full experience, and then
yes.
I was, like, too pregnant to fly, so I couldn't go. Um, but I have ever since then, I have had my eyes on this place, and I've heard nothing but good things about it, and I heard Arizona's also, like, spa capital, so
Yes,
that's my thought.
Scottsdale and Sedona have some really nice spa. I'm
Mhm.
also eyeing Arizona too for just a little weekend getaway.
Yeah.
Love that.
Alright, let's go, let's go.
Let's go. Let's make it happen. We're manifesting this right now. I love it. I love it. Okay, and last question is what is one self-care or wellness activity that you do that you love that might be a little bit unconventional or surprising for most folks to hear?
You know, I have a few. So my newest one, because I just wanna throw this out here real quick, this turned
Mhm.
into like a lesson, but there's like 5 realms of self-care and, the acronym is PIE. So it's physical, intellectual, emotional, social, and spiritual. So
Ooh,
self-care, you could be doing lots of different things. Like it doesn't
yeah.
just have to be like the
Right.
beauty, it doesn't just have to be exercise. Um, but I would say something that I like to do recently is watch YouTube videos, and it's actually my intellectual stimulation. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily like I'm learning things, like, lately I've been into makeup, so there's a
Yes.
aesthetic benefit, but I'm like, I wanna learn techniques, I'm present, I'm
Yeah.
grounded, um, and so that's my new thing. So when y'all start seeing my beat face photos, just know
Period. Just
that's
know
what it's coming from.
Dr. Alicia has been in her bag, in her vibe,
Right.
watching YouTube. I love it. Who's your favorite YouTuber to watch for girls?
Right now, is her name Angui? Ang
Angie.
she's friends Angie, and I can't so I'm thinking I'm, like, visualizing the
Yeah.
name, but she's, like, very petite and thin, she's an influencer, and she has the best outfits,
Yes.
the best hair. I just follow all of her stuff, it's just so much fun to
Oh
watch.
my
Imma
gosh.
send her to you.
Yes, please do. Let's link her below
Yeah.
and we can all learn. We can get snatched together.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alicia, for being here and sharing space with us. We really, really appreciate you. And where can folks find you and stay connected with you?
Yeah, so if you wanna find me on most social platforms, meaning, like, Instagram, if Twitter's
Hmm.
still a thing anymore, LinkedIn and Facebook is,
Hmm.
the handle is Help Me Hodge, so
Hmm.
HelpMeHodge.
Hmm.
And then my website itself is slayyouranxiety.com. That's where you can find information for therapy services,
Hmm.
consultations, media, things like that, or book me for speaking. And so those are the 2
Yes.
places that you'll probably see me the most.
Okay, awesome. We will be sure to link all of those below. And thank you again for being here. We really appreciate you.
Thank you
And
so much for having me. I hope we can collaborate more in the future. You never know, like 2025, we may
yes,
have this Baddie Slay Your Anxiety Miraval takeover.
listen, I love it. We're going to talk offline about that because
We
that
are,
would
we are.
actually be amazing. So
Mhm.
thank you so much again.
All right, take care.
Introducing Saddie Baddie's very first product, My Journey to Self-Love, the ultimate self-care guide by Saddie Baddies. Your transformational self-care journey starts right here. We've created the ultimate self-care guide just for you, with over 60 pages designed to help you discover wellness routines and practices that actually fit your fast-paced lifestyle. Designed to be completed within 8 weeks, this self-care guide encourages you to take simple, practical steps through introspection and awareness to deepen your self-discovery and healing journey. To stay connected, join Saddie Baddies on Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, and more, and sign up for our monthly newsletter on SaddieBaddies.com to stay in the loop. Sending you hella love and stay soft, Baddie.